Pnawn da. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd am ymuno dan ni heddi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We've got a really exciting kind of discussion coming up for just another next hour. And I'm pleased to be here today alongside Dylan Lewis-Rowlands of Renters Reform Coalition Cymru, Sam Coates of Acorn Cardiff, and joining us via the screen is Emma Saunders from Live in Rent Scotland. So maybe, Emma, do you want to say hello first to check that the audio's working and everyone can hear you?
Hello. Hello.
That's a good sign. That's a relief. So in terms of kind of what we're going to be doing today, it's very much a discussion. So I'm going to give each panellist 5 minutes to start off with, just giving their own reaction and reflections on what lessons are there for us to learn from tenants' unions in Wales and Scotland. And then it's going to be a really informal conversation. So if you've got any questions, there's going to be plenty of opportunities. Put your hands up and I'll make sure that we come to you. So if I start off maybe with you, Dylan, do you want to go first and give a bit of your reflections on what do you think are the lessons, kind of what is the state of play for private renters movement in Wales and Scotland right now, and how do you find the position and what maybe are the lessons for us so far?
For me, I guess it's rather tied in with the wider labour movement and the kind of rise we've seen there. Of course, there's some also from Unite Community Wales as well, I'd say that, but I think we can track the rise of tenants' unions and the rise of membership of trade unions quite well. And it's also come at the time, of course, where we're not just going through a crisis of housing, but a crisis of capitalism, arguably the second one in 5 years possibly at this point, which is leading to massive strain on people. We've seen the cost of living crisis. We're seeing, rent hikes over to 20-40% sometimes, and that's not just even in London. That's happening in little rural Welsh villages. There was the case of Aberllefenni. Some people might have seen a few months ago now. It would have been where basically an entire village was just bought up by some property speculators from London. But they were Welsh, so it's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong there because they were all Welsh, it's fine. But of course, it's not fine. So across the entire housing system, we've seen this kind of crisis, and one of the things that's emerged from it, and I think it's good, is tenants' power, and that kind of realisation that I think we're reaching basically the breaking point of what people are willing to tolerate. I think they've tolerated far too much, far too long, in my opinion. But at least we're at that point now, so we're seeing a massive rise in tenants' unions. Not just Acorn, we've also got Unite Community up in Aberystwyth and Machynlleth, which is where I organise. But also independent, like little groups of people coming together as well and just banding together, not under a formal name, and just trying to demand better. And that's the message really, is demanding better. So I think I'd say on that side is positive, we're getting that. But on the other side, we're seeing a massive reaction, of course, from capital, from landlords, and their kind of oppression of tenants' voice, tenants' power. I'd argue that the delay in the Renting Homes Wales Act was not due to legal problems. Well, it was due to legal problems. The legal problems being landlords threatening to sue. That was the legal problem there, in my opinion. Nothing, beyond actual fundamental issues, which then has led us in a system where people basically, we've got a government that are afraid of landlords, afraid of capital flight, afraid of landlords selling up from the market as if houses just disappear if landlords don't own them. That kind of fear of capital flight has really directed government decisions, whereas actually I'm of the opinion government needs to be afraid of renters. Basically, that's my opinion. Government organisations should be afraid of renters because we are the ones with the power, and we need to be the ones demanding change. And that's what we need to do now, is in response to that massive rise in oppression, is start demanding change and start realising the power we all have.
Lovely. Diolch Dylan. Emma, if I come to you next, perhaps, do you want to give us a bit of an idea about the state of play in Scotland at the moment?
So just maybe quickly, I'm Emma Saunders. I'm the national organiser for Living Rent, which is Scotland's tenants' union. We've been sort of organising first as a campaign group since 2014 and then as a union since 2016. And what's been very encouraging in Scotland is that we have had some progress in terms of some reforms. And so I think, for instance, I know that's an English thing around the Renters Reform Coalition Bill. This has happened in Scotland back in 2016, and that was one of the key campaigns Living Rent was involved with. That meant We abolished the equivalent of like no fault grounds for eviction, introduced the private residential tenancy, that is a permanent tenancy with 18 grounds for eviction still, and introduced the notion of rent controls through the rent pressure zones that had been totally ineffective and totally a problem, but at least it was for us the first time that the idea of rent control was back in the debate, sort of the political landscape. And so since we've been building as a union to really have more power and, as you were saying, sort of, confront the housing crisis, because just like in Wales, like the housing crisis here is mad. In some of our cities, in Edinburgh and Glasgow, for instance, rents have gone up by over 60%, according to City Lets, which is sort of a letting agency database. And in Glasgow, it's by over 88% in the last 10 years, which is totally mad. And so some of like our key campaigns just now is around the New Deal for tenants, after that should be a piece of legislation that the Scottish Government introduces in September. And we've been very active during the pandemic around eviction ban, and now the rent freeze, and then the rent cap legislation. So that's a bit the landscape. And I think in terms of what we see emerging as some of the key dynamics in that landscape is, as you were saying, increasing landlord lobby with a use of legal recourses. That is very frightening. So the landlord lobby attacked the Scottish Government for the rent freeze bill. And just now, it's a landlord and short-term let lobby gathered over £350,000 to do a legal inquiry against Edinburgh City Council for their licensing schemes around short-term lets. And the legal inquiry said that, how the licensing scheme was planned was unlawful, and so they're going to have to redo it, and that's helping letting agents and sort of short-term let landlords re-attack the law at the national level. I think so that's one of the key things, and I think one of our key frustration is that it's very much a right to property versus a right to housing, and that's like the defining sort of moment of confrontation, but both are technically seen as human rights, which is mad. Then the second thing we're seeing is that ramping up of the cost of living crisis, and really how that allied with a really poor housing quality stock, both across the social and the private rented sector, is pushing people like more and more into fuel poverty, more and more into having to like choose between rent and food, or just like evict by being priced out of their community. And I think that's really important, because that's feeding into a broader sort of social situation where housing is a key vector of increasing inequality. So if you have access to the bank of mum and dad, you can get on the housing ladder, have a cheaper mortgage, etc., versus if you don't. And it's just becoming more and more entrenched, and I think more and more dangerous at a broader social level. I think in terms of a third lesson, more of like our political campaigning, so we do both local organizing but also political campaigning, is that a lot of the calls for evidence can be quite biased, and there's this sort of neutralizing language of like, we will consult with stakeholders, but when stakeholders are on the opposite spectrum, like landlords and tenant organizations, like what does that consultation mean? And also that neutralizing language of like, we do not want to introduce rent controls because there might be unintended consequences. It's like, fair enough, but the intended consequences just now is rising poverty, is rising inequality, etc. So you can go for unknown, or you can go for known, which is not what you should be going for, i.e. increasing inequality. So really aware of that language and the danger of that language. And I guess that ties into my fourth point of the importance of stories and like practical experiences of people to sort of create the counter narrative around all this sort of sugar-coated language around evidence and unintended consequences, and we need to make a good, sound and fair assessment of everything, and that it's a really depoliticizing language. And so how do we bring in stories and experiences to remake it political? And then I guess maybe the last one is really remembering that it's a systemic issue, and that government might try and like bite size it. So it's going to attack sort of short-term lets, so it's going to maybe try and regulate rent controls or maybe security, etc. But actually housing is systemic, and we can't really think of security without thinking of affordability, without thinking of quality. But also we can't really think about the private rented sector without thinking about like social and council housing as well. And that there is a risk that we start creating different tiers of housing. It's like, oh, you know, council housing is for poor people, vulnerable people, private housing is for this type of people, etc. And I think that's really, really dangerous. And that's also maybe something that can happen a bit more in like charity setting. It's like, oh, let's only talk about social housing, rather than really thinking through like all tenures should be accessible to everyone. And the fact that private housing is so extortionate is a problem, but we really need to think through, everyone also being able to access social council housing, so that it's not seen as like a tenure of last resort.
Lovely, thanks Emma. There's loads there I'm sure we'll come back to kind of during a discussion. If I just hand over to you next, Sam, for you to give your kind of opening reflections.
Diolch. Gwynham da pawb. And yeah, loads of great points already from Dylan and Emma there, a few that I might pick up on in a bit. So I'm the chair of Acorn in Cardiff, and we're, I suppose, the sister union in Wales and England of Living Rent, and we take direct action with our members together to take on cases by members that have come to us with not just housing problems, but in Cardiff's case it has predominantly just been issues with landlords. So I think it's good to talk a bit about the different contexts that we're in different parts of the UK. And it's an interesting kind of experiment really in kind of in terms of how people have tried doing in different countries, what things do we want to avoid doing when we move forward with our changes. So the rent rises that we're experiencing, both of you guys have already talked about that. I think, I haven't got the exact figure, but over 20% since the pandemic, rents have gone up by that in Wales. Some really egregious localised examples of that as well. And crucially, there's a really big difference in rent rises between people that have stayed in their homes and people that are starting new tenancies, and that's something that I think we need to come to in a bit more detail later on. So we get messages not just from our members but from people on our social media every week talking about eviction threats, really egregious rent hikes, and actually things that are illegal. So for example, we had a message from someone recently who was having to sign their new occupation contract, so converting the tenancy, and there was a new clause written in there for an exit fee of £350 plus VAT to change a tenant, which is illegal, but by the time we found out about it, she paid it because tenants aren't told about these things existing. So there's issues of enforcement there, of course, as well. And I think there's been some quite specific kind of problems in the transition period through the implementation of the Renting Homes Act that has changed the incentives of landlords and the things that we're able to do in our cases. For example, not wanting to rescind an eviction notice by only a few weeks, which is what a member in some cases wanted, because that would then mean they would have to wait more than 6 months to do that. So being left in quite a delicate place where they maybe wanted another month, but it can't be in that position. So we do have some differences with the Scottish system in terms of the regulation, of course. We haven't had any rent freezes brought in. There's no rent controls legislation as yet, although we'll talk about that, I'm sure. And we don't have secure contracts at the moment. We have no-fault evictions have not been banned, and we don't have rolling contracts where tenants can stay as long as they want, basically. So just to say a bit more about what we do, our model is from strength in numbers and bringing pressure to bear through direct action on landlords when they're wronging our members. We've been able to hire a full-time organiser for South Wales that's going to be starting new branches of Acorn in the coming year, so that's a really exciting time for tenant power here. and to say a little bit about some of the recent wins we've had, just to kind of show you what's possible with tenant organising. So 2 of our members, Rich and Reese, they got into arrears through no fault of their own. It was kind of work health and safety issues. They were then threatened with eviction because of that, and in the background there were essential repairs that hadn't been done. And by taking on that case and taking escalating direct action, they were allowed to stay in their homes, and there was a timeline for those repairs to be done, which is a really fantastic win. We also had a recent case at the end of last year where a young mother with other family living with her was threatened with eviction around about just before Christmas. That's when that notice was going to come into effect. We delayed that through direct action and negotiations. I think that notice was actually cancelled in the end, and in order for her to find a place in her own time. So this stuff really changes people's lives, right? And I think one reflection I have about the faces we're fighting on the ground is that when a landlord has kind of 1 property, 2 properties, quite, the amateur landlords that make up most of the market, it's relatively easy to use our model and get at least some of what we were hoping for our member in their situation. When you're up against people with 10 or more properties, like really professional landlords, some of the letting agencies that own portfolios themselves, so thinking about people like CPS properties, the really big players, they've got legal teams, they're experienced in trying to stop us, and I think that's something we all need to think about, is how we take on this concentrated part of the market. So a bit briefly on kind of the rent controls green paper. We're very pleased to see that come out, especially when there's been mixed messages coming from Welsh Government in recent months about whether they would take action on rent controls. But we see that needs to be part of a broader package of things. So rent controls on its own is not going to be effective in keeping rents down. What the experience has been in Scotland is that new contracts, new tenancies are when landlords are taking the opportunity to hike up rents. Yeah. So if we have rent controls, but we don't ban no-fault evictions, that's just another backdoor for rents to go up. So we need to make sure that's part of a big package. I think that's all I'll say there. Keen to hear more of the discussion.
Lovely. Well, again, loads of really interesting points there. I'm sure we'll come back to the specifics on. If I move on maybe to kind of thinking about a theme that joins a lot of what you've been talking about, there's a lot of policy discussion there, and about respective power, I guess, people have in those influencing that policy discussion. So wondering, maybe I'll start with you on this one, Sam, about, how proactive do you think the Welsh Government are in listening to you, both as a union, but tenants more broadly as well, when they are having discussions about things like the Green Paper?
They're getting better at it, but it's still very unbalanced, right? So I think the first time we tried to get a meeting with a minister a couple of years ago, that didn't go too well. Now, if we had a specific reason to go and talk to them now, I think we'd get that eventually. We were campaigning during the run-up to the cooperation agreement between Labour and Plaid Cymru to get rent controls into that paper, and we're told that the actions that we took did have a role in allowing that to be put into the agreement. We have now been invited to take part in one of the Welsh Government's task and finish groups, I believe, on issues related to tenants. So there's certainly been some improvement in it, but I think we have to understand that the Residential Landlords Association has an office in Cardiff to make sure that they're getting their points across to government. We're never going to have those resources. So I think if ministers want to kind of level the playing field as they talk about, then there's actually kind of a seesaw effect that you need to take there to take account of the different resources that we have. And just to echo a bit of what Emma was saying there, fundamentally housing is somewhere where people live. That to me comes way before it being anyone's asset. So I think we really need to push back against some of the language that's coming out about doing things in the interest of both sides. Tenants' rights have to come first in this situation. I don't want us to go off and do something like ill thought out that might have unintended consequences, but I think that sort of language is used to prevent change from taking place in the first place.
No, absolutely, and I think to kind of go with that about you need to know where you're trying to head to know whether something is a negative unintended consequence or a positive one in the first place.
Exactly.
Come to you, Dylan. Do you have anything to add to that, or kind of different experiences?
Yeah, I think I'll talk about one thing, which is the Renters Reform Coalition Cymru, which is, I have to say, different from Renters Reform Coalition in England. It just so happens that it's a very good name and I nicked it. But basically, it's something that I think it started, Jenny, was it me and you in NUS conference, I think? Something like that. I got massive credit to Jenny, by the way, for kind of... Yeah, so basically what we're trying to do with Renters Reform Coalition Cymru, or a Glymlaid doing your Rent for Cymru, just a differentiator, I guess. What we're trying to do with that is kind of do some of that more top-end lobbying as part of that. So the idea is that we're not an organisation in and of itself, we're a coalition of organisations. So we have Unite, the unions involved, we have Acorns involved, Shelters involved, People's Assembly is involved, Bevan Foundation is involved. There's loads of different organisations who have a lot of different experience within their organisations as well, coming together to kind of start really coordinating on a much more strategic level on some of these things, and we're hoping to develop this into a much broader project around, hopefully in the future we're looking at things like hopefully strategic litigation as well. We're looking at ensuring the Welsh Government listens to tenant voice and being that kind of counterbalance to the NRLA, if you want to put it in those terms. We're in that room, and under the model of, say, what we're seeing with social partnership, we're going to try and argue that we are one of those social partners then. We are someone who is being in that room, representing people, representing tenants' voice there. So that's really what we're trying to do with Renters Reform Coalition Cymru. And I think it's a really exciting kind of way of working, a different way of working. It's hopefully going to be quite democratic as well in the way it works. So each organisation will have a vote on what we do. It's going to be hopefully a much more kind of not coordinated, cooperative way. That's what I'm looking for. Cooperative way of working that I'm really excited about, and I think that will start hopefully to try and redress some of that the inherent imbalance of power. Because if I just quickly touch on language before I'm quiet for a bit, but quickly if I touch on language, we always talk about a rental market, and I despise that. I despise the word rental market, despite that phrase. I always say a housing system, because it goes back to the way we need to refer, because if we're talking about markets and we're talking about fair rent, we're then talking about, oh, well, we need to be fair to both sides. Well, no, we don't actually, because there's an inherent power imbalance in the renting relationship. Landlords are people who have property, who have vast amounts of wealth in some cases, who have vast amounts of capital at their disposal. We're talking about some of the massive players in the market. Oh, there you go, I just said it myself. In the housing system, they have vast amounts of power, and what we need to do is actually put laws in place. If we have a caring government, if we have a caring society, we want to put laws in place that redress that balance of power. I'd argue eliminate that balance of power entirely. I'm of the opinion we need to get rid of the private rental sector entirely as a long-term ambition. We should only be really looking at things like social renting, cooperative housing, these kind of models. I don't believe that there's a place for the private rental sector in Wales if we're going to be looking towards a cooperative future. But yeah, so that's really kind of the broad summary of what I want to do. But really, I do think that messaging about moving away from the housing market and towards a housing system will really help in some of those discussions, because we are then looking at it in a systematic way, as we were talking earlier. We're not just talking about rents and then forgetting about affordability, or forgetting about quality of housing. We're really understanding that it's a system, and we need to work on it its entirety and not just piece by piece.
Yeah, I think a really interesting thing that's come out of the Green Paper, actually, if anyone's read the research bit before, is that 70% of landlords in Wales own one property, but they only control 30% of the market. To use that term, so 70% of properties that are rented in Wales are actually rented out by people who have at least two properties. So, so depending on which way you present that fact, 70% of landlords own one property. That's a very different conversation to 70% of the market is owned by people who own more than one property. And spinning that conversation, I think, is quite important as well, isn't it? Emma, if I come to you about the position in Scotland, how do you feel your relationship is with the Scottish Government? Do you think there are things for us to learn from in Wales as well?
Yeah, I think we are a bit in a better situation, just in terms of, and I think that comes as well from the political project. I think the SNP, which is the main party in power, does have a political project around independence and knows that to speak, like to sort of win independence, they need to speak to younger people and they need to appeal to a younger audience as well. So I think we've had a bit more leeway in terms of speaking to the government because there's been more interest from the sort of more powerful political party of the SNP, and then having both Labour and the Greens super good on this as well. So I think we're faced with a bit less opposition, which is great. And I think that's meant that we've been able to do a lot of evidence at Parliament. It's meant that we've been able to engage with the ministers. It's meant that we've been able to, be part of quite a few different stakeholder groups. But as said, I think the slight difficulty is that thing of wanting evidence on everything. And it's like, well, you can't really, like, every other country has a different housing crisis and has a different history and has a different housing stock and has different attitudes. So it's really hard to do like proper cross comparisons. And so at one point there needs to be a political decision that's not just about evidence. It's about, who are you favoring and how are you using your full range of powers to address inequality, and housing costs are one of the drivers of inequality. So how are you doing that? I think it's been a bit easier in a way to have conversations around security of tenure, etc., than around affordability of tenure. So the rent cap, the rent freeze, and then subsequent rent cap has been really amazing in terms of showing what is possible, and actually the government can act super fast. Is just, I think, quite a blunt instrument if the rest of the housing market is not tight, in that if you have joint tenancies that enable sort of soft evictions, if you have loads of ground for eviction and hard to contest them, if you have things that aren't covered by private residential tenancies, you create all these loopholes. So you can have a really progressive policy, but then it's undermined by the fact that it's not specific or it's not part of a holistic approach or systemic approach. Sorry, hope that wasn't waffling, but there you go.
No, it was great. It was really helpful. To say we've got about half hour left, so if you've got any questions, put your hand up and I'll come to you. So I can see a couple. I'll one more question and then I'll come to people. So just back to you there, Emma. Then, in terms of, you were talking about some of the positive things that happened in Scotland, but maybe some of the gaps that appeared, the loopholes and stuff. So what do you think are the lessons we can draw then from that experience, so that if we see the Welsh Government do stuff in Wales, that we don't fall into that trap as well ourselves?
Yeah, I think I think a key one is around enforcement. So for instance, we have a rent freeze, but if you have an illegal rent increase, you don't have any mechanism for redress. So you can't take your landlord to tribunal for doing something illegal. If same like the grounds for eviction, so all of our grounds are discretionary now, which was a great victory, but still most people don't take it to tribunal. And so there's a lot of abuse of ground for eviction. A lot of the ground for evictions are vague. So like intention to sell, it's like, what's an intention? Does it have to be realized? So I think that's around security of tenure, joint tenancies, and how at the moment for us, they're both really problematic because you need to have other tenants agree to joint tenancies ending. So then you evict a whole flat and they need to sign a new tenancy that's not rent control, like that isn't protected by the rent cap, or you're trapped in a tenancy, and that can be really difficult for people fleeing domestic violence, for instance. So yeah, that's the security bit. In terms of the quality bit, really, again, that's about compensation and like clear standards and like clear, really easy to use legislation. I think for us, like one of the best example is, for instance, deposits. If your deposit is not registered, you get 3 times the amount of deposit through a really simple tribunal process. It should be the same thing with everything. If your landlord uses an unlawful ground for eviction, you should just get this much back. If your landlord fails to repair your boiler, X, Y, and Z, And so really having that clear sort of stick of the law and ability for tenants to go to tribunal and get their rights enforced. And then in terms of rent controls, I think for us, the key things are it being about the property, not the tenancy, so that you don't have a jigsaw effect where at each new tenancy, the rents go up and then it plateaus and then goes up. Sorry, not jigsaw, staircase. But so really thinking through, that type of comprehensive system. And I think for us, it's really, really important that quality is taken into account, so that landlords have an incentive to improve the quality of the housing stock. And that it's not temporary. So like our fear just now is that they say, oh, it's just like, it's 1 year, but then it explodes again. So you have again that like stop and go approach to legislation. So really having quite permanent approach. So yeah, I think that's it in terms of quality, security and affordability. And yeah, that centerpiece of access to justice and compensation and clear mechanisms to enforce your rights.
Yeah, thanks, Em. I think that enforcement message is one that's really come through, isn't it? We got that with some of the Rent Smart Wales stuff, where landlords can be struck off, but there's not automatically compensation for tenants, in those sorts of circumstances. I could see there were a few hands up, so if I kind of take them in kind of the order of the room. So yeah, if I think there's a mic roaming around as well.
I work on Shelter Cymru's helpline across Wales. And I was just wondering, we've heard quite a lot about rent controls and maybe rent freezes. Are there discussions being had around the local housing allowance, which is shockingly abysmally low in many areas, and specifically for people under 35 as well, where it just isn't fit for purpose, and we see that day in, day out?
Yeah, so, well, actually, we've done quite a bit of work on this as the Better Foundation, where there's been some coverage from the BBC today that there's only work we did in February, only 1.2% of properties on the market was actually available at LHA rates. So there is work going on, lobbying on that. I don't know, I'm not convinced by how successfully it's going, to be honest, at the UK level. I don't know if any of our panels have had experience of engaging on LHA, and is that something you're hearing from any of your members, that people are struggling kind of meeting the cost of their rent because of their benefits, not being enough for that reason?
If I can just quickly pick up on that. Well, first of all, I think there's an issue of discrimination against benefits. Yeah. In the first place, we were running a campaign in Aberystwyth where we were getting letting agencies to say, because they were still saying no DSS, even though that is explicitly not au fait these days. But they were still saying it, so there's discrimination for the benefit system already. And then on top of that, even if someone on benefits gets a tenancy, the LHA doesn't cover it. So they have to top it up with other sources of income. But it's, again, not reaching the levels needed, especially when we're seeing the rent decreases, especially when we're seeing wage suppression, we're seeing all these other issues that are complementing, really bad LHA rates. It's just not, the entire system is not fit for purpose, and sadly that's controlled at a Westminster level, so we'd have to go to Westminster to solve that, and I'm not convinced that the current Westminster government is interested in solving anything beyond their own problems right now. That's as political as I'll probably get today, but luckily for you lot. But yeah, so LHA is a massive thing. I'm supporting someone right now who's on benefits, is working with with an organisation that is kind of the last line of support before they are officially homeless, and there's just no properties available. There's nothing available for them to, so they're living in a HMO in dismal conditions. Their mental health is suffering, so therefore they can't work. So therefore we're going into that poverty spiral again. These fundamental issues need to be addressed, and it's not being addressed.
Sam or Emma, did either of you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just think that LHA is obviously completely inadequate, but the situation we have in Cardiff is that there's such competition for available rentals at the moment that people on benefits just wouldn't get a look in the first place. One of the things we've been working on over the last year is the rise of really like unreasonable demands for guarantors. So not only do they have to own their own home, they have to be on a certain level of income, and people are getting asked to see the deeds to the guarantor's house, and sometimes people have been asked to pay 6 or 12 months rent in advance, either in addition to or as an alternative to having those sorts of guarantors. So we've been doing a little bit of campaigning locally on trying to control that, but I think that locks out people on good incomes. So like the situation that people on benefits in is obviously way worse, as you've been talking about there.
Yeah. Emma, in Scotland, I'm guessing the same kind of pressures are being faced there. There are some further powers around benefits devolved to Scotland. Are you seeing those coming into effect to protect kind of renters who are on benefits?
I think, there's a bit more sort of powers around the discretionary housing payment. That's been very effective. And the mitigation of the bedroom tax, but the situation is still dire. I think maybe as a union, we're a bit concerned because landlords are very happy to be like, let's increase benefits. And that's just a subsidizing of landlords by the government. And I was like, well, no, it should be rents being capped. And so I think we're a bit wary of that discourse of of course we need more benefits, but that's because the system is broken. And instead of doing bandages on the system, how do we actually fix the system? I just don't think landlords deserve to be taking more of our public money.
Absolutely, I think in the long term, absolutely, agree with you there. I could see there was a question at the back, the gentleman in the back had his hand up, so yeah.
Hi, my name is Andrew. I work for Citizens Advice, one of the HSG officers for Citizens Advice All Right.
Sorry, could you bring the microphone a bit closer?
Yeah, a bit better.
Yeah, that's pretty
I
good.
was wondering why it was a bit quiet. My name's Andrew. I'm a HSG officer for Citizens Advice Torvine. To be honest, it was touching upon the LHA really. My fundamental question was, again, focusing on actually is it better to have lobbying in terms of increasing the LHA rate rather than going for the rent controls, because what the real risk at the moment is you further risk alienating landlords that are already impacted by obviously these changes, which rightly so. My job isn't to become political in Citizens Advice's capacity, but obviously with respect to the changes that have already come into effect for landlords, another change now saying, right, you can't charge more than this, further alienates those landlords, and in doing that, at the moment, there really isn't a social stock to take over those landlords basically up in a shop. So I guess my question has to be slightly changed because you've addressed part of the LHA discussion from that lady's question. I guess, should there be more to basically challenge that LHA and lobby central government for the LHA to be changed, rather than introducing another subsequent change that landlords have to then adjust to again, which essentially pushes them out of the market?
Thanks.
Can I go?
If you want to, you go first.
I first take something Emma said and kind of put it in more blunt terms, which is LHA is basically a state facilitated transfer of wealth to landlords. That's all. That's what the function of LHA basically is. So I would not be advocating for landlords to be getting more money and therefore more power in our system. And the system is fundamentally broken, and you don't then fix the system by just putting bandages on it. You need to change the entire system. And something like rent caps, or something like rent controls, again, I don't even think that goes far enough to change the system. That is merely a delaying tactic, really, giving government more time to actually solve the problem, in my opinion. But yeah, so I would not be for us lobbying for LHA, of course, if the groups involved decide to, democratically decide to lobby for that, then we will push that because that's what democracy is. But certainly I'd be advocating for us to look at more strategic and systematic ways of changing the system, because again, LHA is literally just, when you bare bones it is just a transfer of wealth to landlords. And we should not be, and I don't believe the public purse should be in the business of doing that.
Sorry, I just wanted
Do they need one?
We've got to retain that stock, and I guess to retain that stock and to retain that them in the market, what has to be the carrot for them to stay? And obviously the LHA rep, we're saying that the LHA rate is, state funded, yeah, again agree. But on the other side of that is obviously your position is to lift people out of poverty. Obviously the people who are most affected by the LHA rate are the people who are most in poverty. So yeah, just wanted to come back to that if that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe if I can jump in on that.
Go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess it's very much like, maybe if I can answer a bit of a sort of cheeky question, is like, you need to either go down like a route, like, I guess for me, you need to be coherent in what you're doing as a government. And so if you have decided that actually you want to be coherent and go down a market route for housing, which is not what I advocate, but let's say, then I would say, well, actually, we need to be thinking about consumer protections because we have none. We need to be thinking about competition, and there's none. We need to be thinking about if we're thinking about housing as a market, why are landlords so protected? Because in any other markets, they're not. So they're not allowed to fail. Any small startup or business has a 70% chance of failure. We don't allow landlords to fail. How come? So I'm like, if you want to go down that sense that housing is a sort of market asset, then treat the whole housing system as a market and be fair in that. If you think that housing is not a market asset, then start thinking that housing providers should not be ruled by market rules. And yeah, they should follow the higher standards. So I think that's maybe my frustration, is that there's double standards on everything. And that is at the benefits of landlords.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. I think that's a really important point, and I think it comes back to kind of an unintended consequence question we were talking about. Earlier as well about kind of, is landlords leaving the market a good thing or a bad thing? Depends on what the long-term policy objective is, doesn't it? So I think I guess that question has been teased out here again, is that there isn't that coherent plan in Wales about what we want the housing market to achieve, is there? I guess in that sense. Any further questions? I think Jenny, you had your hand there.
I was going to talk about the enforcement. Oh, thank you. I was going to come back to enforcement again because, as you say, that's come out a lot, hasn't it? And if we're talking about rent controls and the like, we're really guilty, aren't we, of making these wonderful new rights and entitlements in theory that in practice don't affect people's lives, aren't we? Renting Homes Wales Act has got some really great theoretical protections, but they're not legal aidable. So the fitness for human habitation, for example, how are we gonna make that stick? The point about if you're living in an unfit property, you don't have to pay rent. When's that going to happen? We're trying to use the retaliatory eviction defence in court. We haven't made it work yet because the judges have been quite cautious.
If I can pick on that directly, because literally, sorry, I keep looking at my phone because as I say, I'm working with someone right now who's in HMO. They withheld their rent because of fit humanitarian requirement. They've just literally today been served with an eviction notice. We're talking about that kind of, which is theoretically, again, as you said, theoretically illegal under Renting Homes Wales, but no one's, our member who is in a HMO on £300 a month is not going to be able to finance the lawyer needed to defend that, which is one of the reasons why I think Renters Coalition Cymru should be doing that work. But that enforcement isn't there, and until it is there, landlords are just going to run roughshod over the entire system.
So that was my question, is kind of like what is the model that works? And looking to Scotland, because it's always been our creed, isn't it, that, well, let's end no-fault evictions, and then that's a major factor keeping tenants quiet that won't be there anymore. We haven't got a tribunal like we've got in Scotland, but maybe that's something we need to get. But it was just really interesting to hear you talking, Emma, about the access to justice issues that you still have, even though you've ended no-fault evictions. So yeah, what lessons have you got for us in Wales in terms of enforcement? Is there a model that could work? You know, is there a tribunal that could work, or is it about probably funding environmental health services, or looking at our Rent Smart Wales? Yeah, any insights you could share with us would be great.
Yeah, fab. Emma,
yeah.
I'll come to you.
Sorry, I jumped in there. Yeah, so I think that the problem is not the system in itself, it's the rights. So yeah, I think a tiny bit around the system in itself is it being properly sort of funded. So like having the funding at the local authority level, having enough staff at the tribunal level, etc. But then it is the rules. Like right now, in terms of quality, homes should follow a tolerable standard. What does that mean? You can't get compensation if you haven't had like running water in your house. What is that? Like basically, and that's why I think it's really good to know which laws are really working for tenants and enable them to like exercise their rights. And deposit laws have been great, or like illegal fees laws have been like quite easy because there's clear penalties. Landlords break the law, they need to give 3 times the deposit back. We're just doing that for illegal evictions. Landlord illegally evict you, you get up to 36 times your rent back, etc. And so just, I think really making sure there is that enforcement is thought through legislation and thought through regulations. And I think, yeah, then having a clear pathway of who's responsible for what, because at the moment, like local authorities are responsible for landlord legislation, some environmental health, but then some like quality gets done at tribunal, and it's very unclear like where you should go as a tenant. And so really having that clear pathway, and then in all the pathways, yeah, clear standards and clear mechanisms for penalties. And I think, sorry, just on the last point as well around alienating landlords, I think I find it, again, I'm being a bit cheeky with this, but it does feel like blackmail. It's like, oh, you can't do anything, otherwise we'll evict you. Oh, you can't do anything, otherwise we'll break the law and make you homeless. It's like, oh, so the government is going to lean into blackmail of like, people will break the law and that's why we're not going to improve the law. And that also feels very enraging. Like, no, the law is there to achieve something. And if people break the law, then they should go to prison. And maybe that's part of the enforcement thing, is like landlords should face higher consequences if they break the law.
Thank you, Emma. Sam, if I could kind of give the version of that to you as well, as someone who's involved with, with Acorn, what are your experiences around this? Is it the direct action that you're having to resort to? Or are you finding legal recourse as well, to support your members in some of the challenges they're facing?
So we don't push legal things ourselves. Our model as a union is that when the law fails or should have succeeded but is not a real recourse, as you've said, Jenny, that's when we apply direct action to try and do that. And I was concerned about the retaliatory eviction thing, so it's really bad news to hear that isn't having the effect that it intended. We've had some of our members accompany others to court hearings recently, and that's been a really illuminating thing to do, basically, because I think there's wording in some of the Renting Homes Act about a judge does not have to issue a eviction notice, for example, which leaves a lot of room for manoeuvre there as well. And I think we had an example recently where someone was going to court to fight an eviction notice, and it turns out that the landlord hadn't protected the deposit. A very big deal in theory, right? But what the judge did was say, you can't evict them on this occasion, come back and do it properly, because they've made a mistake with it. So yeah, really, 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 really serious issues, and we're finding that kind of building our power as a union is one of the only ways we have at the moment to try and make these, to enforce things ourselves, which is not something we should have to do. We should be able to rely on our politicians to look out for such a big proportion of the population.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got about 5 minutes left if anyone had any further questions.
Just kind of picking up back on that LHA thing, but considering what power we actually do have, do you think that it's worthy to like push for that to be considered the marketable rent, and then for, you know, the Fair Rents Committee to be using that as a benchmark and sort of pushing a bit of enforcement that way? Because honestly, it's such a large part of our work where we're just seeing people who have no choice seemingly but to get into rental years, and I know we're limited, but we've got some great minds in this room, so I'm just putting it out there.
I don't think this issue is going to be solved until we change the entire system. It goes back to what I said earlier about the entire system being broken. And just to highlight another case of that, the Minister earlier rightly talked about the inflationary pressures on housing. You know, what I often talk about is sometimes the profit pressures on housing. And that's not just the landlord, that is also the building of housing. You know, saying the Welsh Government, you know, is rightly concerned that 10% of all its money is now worthless because of inflation, or 20% of their money is worthless when they give it to a private company to build houses, because that money is not going to build houses, it's going to create profit. You know, so it goes back to that idea again that the entire system is fundamentally flawed, and I don't think we're going to solve something as fundamental as LHA, because of course we've got a state which wants to transfer wealth to landlords. LHA is a massive part and fundamental part of the housing system. That's not going to be solved until we fundamentally change the housing system. And it's worthy to try. You know, I'm not someone who's an accelerationist who believes that, you know, the lives of the poor should be absolutely, you know, miserable. That's not what I believe at all. So we should be fighting these battles where we can, but also recognising and putting in the grand scheme of things of, was it you said a few months ago, Wales doesn't have a strategic vision for housing, which, you know, that's what we need, is a strategic vision for housing in Wales. And until we get that strategic vision, we're not going to get anywhere on any of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've covered quite a lot of topics, but I thought maybe if we can try and finish maybe on an upbeat note to make us feel...
Sorry about that.
No, absolutely. So I'm thinking if quickly kind of, you know, as you said, there's so many places to start in terms of how do we resolve kind of the housing system, kind of where the challenges are. So maybe you could identify, each of you, kind of one place where you think that we should be starting. What should be our priority for the next 6 months, next 12 months, about here's where we should be starting to work towards that kind of space where we want to end up with. So maybe if I come to you first, Sam, drop that on you. But yeah, where would you like to start?
No worries. So reflecting a bit on some of this DHA stuff, I think we need to start talking about ownership and put that into kind of the discussion about, you know, what kind of system and housing strategy we want. Cardiff Council last year actually bought, I think, about 20 houses off of private landlords, I think mainly because there were large families on benefits in there, and that was seen as the best way to prevent homelessness in those cases. Gwynedd Council has started just buying houses on a small scale as well. And, you know, the Welsh Government, if it wanted to make that part of its portfolio of things that could be done, would have some scale to do something with that. So I think we're much better off putting time in pushing what the vision is rather than pushing for one small change to the most, you know, urgent problem right now. If we solve that, then something else is going to come along in a few years' time, and then we'll still be where we started. You know, so I think we need to talk about ownership, basically.
Maybe I'll go to Emma next. Emma.
Yeah, I guess what makes me feel positive is that it does feel like there's a lot more people angry and willing to push for change. And I'm not going to speak about Wales, but at least in Scotland, I think increasingly tenants do feel entitled to proper rights. And I think that's really, really important, is that we don't start sort of, we start feeling that actually, it's important that we think about housing as a right rather than as a commodity that we should be grateful that we have a tiny bit of access to. And I think, I guess I'm excited for what happens to a society that starts centering that rather than other things. And I'd like us to start imagining housing a bit like what we imagine in health. It's like, what would a public provision of housing look like? And yeah, I really have this sense of like thinking through public goods rather than more money to pay for privatized goods.
Lovely, thank you. And Dylan, we come to you.
Pithily, I'd say abolish capitalism. In actuality, I guess, rather than saying something that make me hopeful, I'd say something that should make everyone here hopeful, and that is if you join join a workplace union, but also join a community union. And if you have the ability to help, even if that's dedicating an hour a month to helping out somebody who's in trouble, you know, through a community union, that's a material change you could possibly make to someone's life, and that can possibly be the most hopeful message of all.
Lovely. Well, I think that's a lovely note to kind of bring the conversation to a close. So if you could join me in thanking the panellists in the usual manner.